In 1979, a man named Jim Lewis picked up the phone and called a stranger. The stranger's name was Jim Springer. They were identical twins, separated at birth and adopted by different families in Ohio. They had never met. They had never spoken. They knew nothing about each other's lives. And yet, when they finally sat down together for the first time at the age of 39, what they discovered was so uncanny that it would change the course of behavioral science forever. Both had been named James by their adoptive families. Both had childhood dogs named Toy. Both had married women named Linda, divorced them, and then married women named Betty. Both had sons, one named James Allen, the other James Allen. Both had worked in law enforcement. Both drove Chevrolets. Both chain-smoked Salem cigarettes. Both drank Miller Lite beer. Both bit their fingernails. Both suffered from the same type of tension headaches that began at the same age. Both had built white benches around trees in their backyards. Both had gained 10 pounds at the same point in their lives and then lost it again. This was not a coincidence. The probability of this many specific parallels occurring by chance in two unrelated lives is so astronomically small that it effectively rounds to zero. Something connected these two men across 39 years of complete separation. Something synchronized their choices, their preferences, their habits, and their bodies with a precision that no genetic model has ever been able to fully explain. The Jim twins, as they came to be known, were among the first participants in what would become the most important twin study in the history of psychology. The Minnesota study of twins, reared apart, launched by Thomas Bouchard at the University of Minnesota in 1979. Over the following 2 decades, Bouchard and his team studied more than 100 pairs of identical twins who had been separated at birth and raised in different families, different cities, sometimes different countries, with no knowledge of each other's existence. And what they found, again and again, was the same disturbing pattern. Twins who had never met were living parallel lives with a degree of synchronization that defied every conventional explanation. The standard explanation for these parallels is genetic. Identical twins share 100% of their DNA. Since genes influence personality, preferences, and behavior, it is not surprising the argument goes that identical twins would make similar choices even in different environments. Their genes predispose them towards certain personality traits, and those traits express themselves in similar life decisions. This explanation is partially correct, and it would be dishonest to dismiss it. Behavioral genetics has established, beyond reasonable doubt, that genes play a significant role in shaping personality. The Minnesota study itself contributed enormously to this understanding, estimating that roughly 50% of the variation in personality traits like extroversion, neuroticism, and openness to experience can be attributed to genetic factors. This is real and important science, but the genetic explanation has a problem. It explains the general patterns and fails to account for the specific ones. Genes can predispose you toward introversion or extroversion. They cannot make you name your dog Toy. Genes can influence whether you are drawn to law enforcement or to artistic careers. They cannot make you marry a woman named Linda, divorce her, and then marry a woman named Betty. Genes can affect your susceptibility to tension headaches. They cannot make those headaches begin at the same age, with the same symptoms, on the same side of the head. The level of specificity in the twin parallels exceeds anything that genetic predisposition can account for. Something else is at work. Bouchard himself acknowledged this in his published papers, though cautiously. He noted that the degree of similarity between separated identical twins was, in many cases, greater than what genetic models predicted. He did not speculate publicly about what the additional factor might be, because he was a rigorous scientist operating within the framework of behavioral genetics, and that framework did not have a place for whatever this additional factor was. But the data was clear. Genes were necessary but not sufficient to explain the twin parallels. Something was missing from the picture. Let us look at more of the data, because the Jim twins were not an isolated case. They were the most famous, but they were not the most extraordinary. Oscar Stohr and Jack Yuffe were identical twins, born in Trinidad in 1933 to a Jewish father and a German mother. They were separated shortly after birth. Oscar was raised by his grandmother in Nazi Germany, where he joined the Hitler Youth. Jack was raised by his father in Trinidad and later moved to Israel, where he worked on a kibbutz and served in the Israeli Navy. Their cultural environments could not have been more different, one raised as a Nazi, the other as a Jew. And yet, when Bouchard brought them together at the University of Minnesota, the parallels were staggering. Both wore wire-rimmed glasses, both had short, clipped mustaches, both had a habit of storing rubber bands on their wrists, both flushed the toilet before using it, both liked to sneeze loudly in elevators to startle people, both read magazines from back to front, both dipped buttered toast in their coffee. The cultural explanation collapses entirely in this case. These men were raised in diametrically opposed cultural environments. Everything that culture, upbringing, and experience should have made different about them was different: their languages, their politics, their religions, their national identities. And yet beneath all of those cultural layers, something identical was expressing itself in habits so specific and so idiosyncratic that no theory of cultural influence can touch them. Flushing the toilet before using it is not a German trait. Sneezing in elevators is not a Jewish trait. Dipping toast in coffee is not a product of either Nazi ideology or kibbutz socialism. These are expressions of something deeper than culture, deeper than upbringing, deeper, perhaps, than genetics alone. Bridget Harrison and Dorothy Lowe, identical twins separated at birth in Britain, were reunited in 1979. When they met, both were wearing 7 rings on their fingers. Both wore 2 bracelets on one wrist and a watch and a bracelet on the other. Neither had discussed jewelry with the other. Neither knew the other existed until shortly before the meeting. The probability of 2 women independently choosing to wear exactly 7 rings and distributing bracelets and watches across their wrists in the same pattern is again vanishingly small. Daphne Goodship and Barbara Herbert, another pair of British twins separated at birth, met for the first time at age 40. Both had fallen down the stairs at age 15 and weakened the same ankle. Both had met their husbands at a dance at age 16. Both had suffered miscarriages at the same time, then given birth to 2 boys and then a girl, in the same order. Both were afraid of heights. Both drank their coffee cold. Both had the same crooked little finger. Amy and Beth, twins separated at birth and reunited in their 20s, discovered that both had studied piano. Both had a fear of water that began at age 7. Both had chosen the same unusual shade of teal to paint their bedrooms, and both kept a journal in which they wrote in the same distinctive handwriting. The handwriting detail is particularly significant. Handwriting is supposed to be a product of fine motor learning, shaped by years of practice in specific educational environments. 2 people trained by different teachers in different schools using different methods should develop different handwriting. And yet these twins, who had never seen each other write, produced script that a forensic graphologist could not distinguish. The catalogue of these parallels extends across Bouchard's entire dataset, and it extends far beyond what behavioral genetics can explain. Height, weight, blood pressure, heart rate, brainwave patterns, dental patterns, onset age of grey hair, age of first menstruation, age of first sexual experience. All of these showed correlations in separated identical twins that were as high as, and sometimes higher than, the correlations in identical twins raised together. Whatever was synchronizing these twins was not being transmitted through shared environment. It was something they carried with them from conception, something that operated across distance and across time, something that linked them at a level beneath culture, beneath experience, beneath conscious choice. The neuroscience of twin connection takes this even further. In 2009, a study published in the journal Cerebral Cortex by researchers at the University of Helsinki examined the brain structure of identical and fraternal twins using high-resolution MRI imaging. They found that identical twins showed extraordinary similarity, not just in brain size and overall structure which you would expect from shared genetics, but in the fine-grained patterns of cortical folding, the specific topography of the brain's surface. The folds and ridges of the cerebral cortex, which developed through a complex interaction of genetics and prenatal environment, were nearly identical in monozygotic twins. The pattern of your brain's surface is as unique as a fingerprint, and yet, in identical twins, even those raised apart, the fingerprints matched. More provocatively, studies of twin brain activity have shown correlated neural responses, even when the twins are in separate locations. A pilot study by the neuroscientist Todd Richards at the University of Washington placed one twin inside an fMRI scanner and stimulated the other twin in a separate room. When the distant twin was exposed to a startling stimulus, a bright flash of light, the twin inside the scanner showed a measurable response in the visual cortex, despite having received no stimulus at all. The effect was small and has not been consistently replicated at a level that would satisfy skeptics, but it has been observed in multiple studies across multiple laboratories, and it refuses to disappear entirely from the data. A more controlled study, conducted by the psychologist Guy Playfair and documented in his book Twin Telepathy, examined dozens of cases in which one twin was subjected to a surprise stimulus, a sudden shock, a startling image, a painful sensation, while the other twin was monitored in a separate, isolated room. Playfair reported that in a statistically significant number of cases, the unstimulated twin showed measurable physiological responses, changes in galvanic skin response, heart rate, or blood pressure that correlated in time with the stimulus delivered to the other twin. The effect was not consistent across all pairs and not present in all trials, which is why it has not been universally accepted, but it appeared often enough, and in enough different experimental contexts, to resist easy dismissal. The parapsychology literature on twin telepathy is extensive and controversial. Skeptics point out that publication bias, small sample sizes, and methodological inconsistencies plague the field. These criticisms are valid and must be taken seriously. But what the skeptics rarely address is the sheer volume and consistency of the anecdotal reports. When thousands of twins across dozens of cultures independently report the same type of experience, feeling the other's pain, knowing the other's thoughts, sensing the other's danger, the dismissal of all of these reports as coincidence or fabrication requires its own extraordinary explanation. The psychiatrist Ian Stevenson at the University of Virginia documented what he called simultaneous physical symptoms in identical twins. In his case files, he recorded instances in which one twin experienced a physical event, a burn, a fall, a sudden onset of pain, and the other twin, at the same moment, in a different location, experienced the same physical sensation without any causal connection. A twin in London feels sudden chest pain at the exact moment her twin sister in Edinburgh has a heart attack. A twin in New York develops a rash on his left arm at the exact moment his brother in California burns his left arm in a kitchen accident. These reports are anecdotal, and anecdotes are not data, but they are numerous, consistent, and reported by people with no reason to fabricate them, and they appear across every culture that has twins, suggesting that the phenomenon, whatever it is not culturally constructed. The standard scientific response to all of this is to invoke coincidence and confirmation bias. People notice parallels and ignore differences. Twins are not as similar as the cherry-picked stories suggest. The unspectacular cases, twins with different careers, different tastes, different lives, do not make the news. This is a legitimate criticism, and it applies to some of the more dramatic anecdotes. But it does not apply to the systematic data from the Minnesota study, which used rigorous statistical controls and tested hundreds of traits across hundreds of twin pairs. The correlations in the systematic data are real, and they are larger than genetic models predict. There is another objection that is less often discussed but more fundamental. The genetic explanation assumes that the genome is a blueprint that determines traits. But modern genetics has revealed that this is not how genes work. The genome is not a blueprint. It is a set of instructions that are interpreted differently depending on the cellular environment, the epigenetic modifications, the stochastic noise of molecular interactions. Two identical genomes, placed in different environments, should produce different outcomes, not because the genes are different, but because the interpretation of the genes is different. Epigenetics has shown us that environmental factors can alter gene expression without changing the DNA sequence. Diet, stress, toxin exposure, social experience, all of these modify which genes are active and which are silent. And since separated twins grow up in different environments, their epigenetic profiles should diverge over time, producing increasing differences as they age. But this is not what the data shows. Separated identical twins do not diverge as much as epigenetic theory predicts. They remain more similar than they should be, given their different environments. Something is maintaining the synchronization despite the environmental differences. Something is keeping the parallel tracks aligned even when the trains are running on different continents. Bouchard, in a 1990 paper in Science, one of the most prestigious scientific journals in the world, reported that for virtually every behavioral trait measured, identical twins reared apart were as similar as identical twins reared together. Read that again. Twins who grew up in the same household, sharing the same meals, the same schools, the same parents, the same daily experiences, they were no more similar than twins who grew up in completely different households with no contact whatsoever. The shared environment, everything that makes a family contributed almost nothing to the similarity. The genetic contribution was enormous, but it was not the whole story. And the part of the story that was not genetic was not environmental either. It was something else. Something that the categories of nature and nurture between them could not capture. There is one more phenomenon in twin research that deserves attention before we move on. Cryptophasia. This is the term for the private languages that many identical twins develop in early childhood languages, with their own vocabulary, grammar, and syntax that no one outside the twin pair can understand. Approximately 40% of identical twins develop some form of private language. These languages are not babbling or baby talk. Linguists who have studied them have found that they contain consistent phonological rules, semantic categories, and even recursive grammatical structures. They are real languages, invented from scratch by two children who apparently share enough cognitive architecture to construct a communication system that works perfectly between them and is opaque to everyone else. Cryptophasia is usually explained as a product of the twins' shared developmental environment. They spend so much time together that they naturally develop shared communicative shortcuts. This explanation works for twins raised together. It does not explain the documented cases of separated twins who, upon meeting for the first time, immediately fall into a pattern of communication that observers describe as eerily synchronized, finishing each other's sentences, laughing at the same moments, using the same unusual words and phrases despite having grown up in different linguistic environments. It is as if the shared language was not learned but remembered, as if the communication channel was not built but reopened. What is this? Something else? The honest scientific answer is, we do not know. Behavioral genetics does not have a name for it. Neuroscience does not have a mechanism for it. Epigenetics cannot explain it. The standard tools of biology account for a large portion of the twin similarities, but they leave a residual, a consistent, measurable, statistically significant residual that points toward a connection between identical twins that operates through no known physical channel. And here is where the investigation becomes truly interesting, because there is a physical phenomenon that behaves exactly the way the twin connection appears to behave, a phenomenon in which two entities, once connected, maintain a correlated state regardless of the distance between them, regardless of the time elapsed, and regardless of any known physical mechanism linking them. It is called quantum entanglement, and it is the strangest confirmed fact in the history of physics. In 1935, Albert Einstein, Boris Podolsky, and Nathan Rosen published a paper that was intended to demonstrate a flaw in quantum mechanics. They described a scenario in which two particles that had once interacted were separated by a large distance. According to quantum mechanics, measuring the state of one particle would instantaneously determine the state of the other, regardless of how far apart they were. Einstein found this absurd. He called it spooky action at a distance, and argued that it proved quantum mechanics was incomplete, that there must be hidden variables, local properties of the particles that predetermine their states, making the apparent instant correlation a mere artifact of shared information rather than genuine non-local connection. Einstein was wrong. In 1964, the physicist John Bell devised a theorem that could distinguish between Einstein's hidden variable explanation and the genuine non-local correlation predicted by quantum mechanics. And in 1982, the French physicist Alain Aspect performed the experiment that tested Bell's theorem. The result was unambiguous. The correlations between entangled particles were real, non-local, and could not be explained by hidden variables or by any signal traveling between the particles at any speed, including the speed of light. Two particles that had once been entangled remained correlated across any distance, instantaneously, through no known physical mechanism. Aspect's experiment was a watershed moment in physics. It demonstrated that the universe is fundamentally non-local, that events in one location can be instantaneously correlated with events in another location, with no signal passing between them and no time delay for information to travel. This non-locality is not a theoretical abstraction. It is an experimental fact that has been confirmed with increasing rigor over 4 decades. In 2015, a team at Delft University of Technology performed a loophole-free Bell test that closed every remaining experimental loophole, confirming entanglement with a degree of certainty that leaves no room for alternative explanations. The universe is non-local. Separated systems can be correlated in ways that no local mechanism can explain. This result has been confirmed in hundreds of subsequent experiments, with increasing precision and rigor. In 2022, Alan Aspect, John Clauser, and Anton Zeilinger received the Nobel Prize in Physics for their experimental confirmation of quantum entanglement and their demonstration of Bell inequality violations. Entanglement is not speculative. It is not fringe. It is one of the most thoroughly established facts in modern physics, and its properties are precisely the properties that the twin connection appears to exhibit. Two entities, once connected at origin, maintaining correlated states across distance through no known physical channel. The entangled particles were created together and then separated. The identical twins were created together and then separated. The entangled particles maintain correlated states regardless of distance. The identical twins maintain correlated behaviors regardless of distance. The entangled particles' correlation cannot be explained by shared information or hidden variables. The identical twins' correlation cannot be fully explained by shared genes or shared environment. The parallel is structural, not metaphorical. It is not that twins are like entangled particles. It is that the pattern of connection, correlation without communication, synchronization without signal, unity without contact is the same pattern in both cases. And the question that no one in mainstream science is willing to ask openly, but that the data increasingly demands, is whether the pattern is the same because the mechanism is the same. Whether identical twins are, at some level that current biology does not describe and current physics only hints at, genuinely entangled, this is not a question that can be answered by the science we have today. It sits at the intersection of quantum physics, neuroscience, and the philosophy of consciousness, three fields that have not yet found a common language, let alone a common framework. But it is a question that the data makes legitimate, and it is a question that, as we will discover, the world's contemplative traditions have been asking for a very long time. Because the idea that two bodies can share a single conscious connection, that individuality is not as absolute as it seems, that the boundaries between oneself and another are not as solid as we assume is not a modern curiosity. It is one of the oldest and most persistent themes in human spiritual thought. In the Islamic tradition, there is a concept that bears directly on this question. The Quran, in Surah Al-Araf, verse 172, describes a primordial event in which God gathered all human souls before the creation of the physical world and addressed them collectively, "Am I not your Lord?" And they all responded, "Yes, we testify." This event, known as the Covenant of Alast, describes a moment in which all human consciousnesses existed together in the presence of God before being separated into individual bodies and sent into the physical world. Every soul knew every other soul. Every consciousness was in direct contact with every other consciousness. And then they were separated, distributed into bodies, scattered across time and space, each one forgetting the original unity. The structural parallel to quantum entanglement is extraordinary. In entanglement, two particles interact in a unified quantum state and are then separated, but they retain their correlation despite the separation. In the Covenant of Alast, all souls exist in a unified divine presence and are then separated into individual bodies, but they retain, if only unconsciously, their connection to the original unity. The physics describes particles, the theology describes souls. The structure is identical: unity, separation, and persistent connection despite the separation. The Islamic Hadith literature adds a further dimension. A Hadith narrated in Sahih Muslim states that souls are like conscripted soldiers. Those that recognize each other come together, and those that do not recognize each other turn away from each other. This is a remarkable statement. It describes the experience of instant connection or instant aversion between strangers as a function of pre-existing soul relationships that were established before embodiment. In the primordial gathering, twins, in this framework, would be souls that not only recognized each other in the original covenant, but were so closely aligned that their connection survived the transition into physical form with unusual strength and clarity. The Sufi tradition develops this concept with particular depth. The great Sufi poet Rumi wrote extensively about the soul's longing for reunion with its original source, the haunting melody of the reed flute, separated from the reed bed, crying to return. For Rumi, every human connection, every friendship, every love, every inexplicable sense of familiarity with a stranger is a faint echo of the original unity in which all souls existed together. Twins, in this framework, would be souls whose connection from the primordial covenant is unusually strong, souls that were, perhaps, particularly close in the original gathering, and whose entanglement survived the separation into bodies with unusual intensity. In Hinduism, the concept of the Ashvins offers a mythological framework that speaks directly to the mystery of twins. The Ashvins are divine twins, celestial physicians, healers, bringers of light, who always appear together, always act in perfect synchronization, and are described in the Rig Veda as two bodies sharing a single chariot, a single purpose, a single divine identity. They are not two gods who happen to cooperate. They are one divine principle expressed through two forms. The multiplicity is apparent. The unity is real, and this connects to the deepest claim in Hindu philosophy, the doctrine that Atman, the individual self, is Brahman, the universal consciousness. If all individual selves are, at the deepest level, expressions of a single universal awareness, then the connection between twins is not anomalous. It is simply the clearest, most visible manifestation of a connection that exists between all conscious beings. Twins are not special because they are connected. They are special because their connection is strong enough to be obvious. The rest of us are equally connected, but the signal is buried beneath the noise of apparent separation. We are only at the beginning of this investigation. We have established the data. Identical twins separated at birth, live parallel lives, with a degree of synchronization that genetics alone cannot explain. We have identified the structural parallel, quantum entanglement, in which two entities once connected maintain correlated states across any distance through no known mechanism. And we have heard the first whispers from the contemplative traditions that the separation of individual consciousnesses from an original unity is the foundational story of human existence, and that the connections we observe between twins may be the most visible thread of a web that connects all conscious beings. In the next stage of this investigation, we will go deep into the physics of entanglement itself, what it actually is, what it actually does, and what it tells us about the nature of reality. Because entanglement is not just a curiosity of particle physics, it is a fundamental feature of the universe, and its implications for the nature of consciousness, identity, and the boundaries between oneself and another are far more radical than most people realize. The question is not whether twins are connected. The data has already answered that. The question is what kind of connection it is. And the answer may force us to rethink everything we believe about where one person ends and another begins. Quantum entanglement is the most counterintuitive, the most experimentally confirmed, and the most philosophically disturbing phenomenon in all of physics. It tells us something about the nature of reality that the human mind resists accepting, that Einstein himself spent the last 30 years of his life trying to disprove, and that the Nobel Committee finally acknowledged in 2022 as one of the foundational truths of the physical universe. And yet, despite its importance, most people, including most scientists outside of quantum physics, do not understand what entanglement actually is. They know it involves particles being connected across distances. They know it is strange, but they do not grasp just how strange it is, or what it implies about the fabric of reality itself. So let us be precise. Let us understand entanglement not through metaphors or simplified analogies, but through what the experiments actually tell us. Because only when you understand the physics clearly can you see why the connection to consciousness and to twins is not a poetic stretch, but a structural necessity. Start with a simple scenario. You have two particles, let us say two photons, that are created together in a single quantum event. For example, a special crystal can split one photon into two entangled photons moving in opposite directions. Before anyone measures either photon, each one exists in a superposition of states. For polarization, this means each photon is simultaneously horizontally and vertically polarized, not one or the other, but both at once. This is not a statement about our ignorance. It is a statement about reality. The photon does not have a definite polarization that we simply do not know. It genuinely has no definite polarization until it is measured. Now, here is where entanglement enters. The two photons are not independently superposed. They are correlated. Their superpositions are linked in such a way that the outcome of measuring one photon instantaneously determines the outcome of measuring the other, regardless of the distance between them. If you measure photon A and find it horizontally polarized, photon B will be found vertically polarized instantly, with no time delay, no matter how far apart they are. If you measure photon A and find it vertically polarized, photon B will be found horizontally polarized. The correlation is perfect and instantaneous. The obvious explanation is that the photons were assigned their polarizations at the moment of creation like a pair of gloves, one left and one right, put in separate boxes. When you open one box and find a left glove, you know the other box contains a right glove. No mystery, no non-locality, just information that was determined from the start. This is the hidden variables explanation that Einstein championed. It was intuitive, sensible, and wrong. John Bell proved it was wrong. His 1964 theorem showed that if the correlations between entangled particles were due to hidden variables' predetermined properties assigned at creation, then the correlations would obey a specific mathematical limit, now called Bell's inequality. If the correlations were genuinely quantum, genuinely non-local, genuinely created at the moment of measurement rather than predetermined at the moment of creation, then they would violate Bell's inequality. The correlations would be stronger than any local hidden variable theory could produce. The mathematics of Bell's theorem is elegant and devastating. It sets an upper limit on how strongly correlated two particles can be if their properties are determined locally. That is, if each particle carries its own predetermined instructions and the measurement of one has no effect on the other. This upper limit is called the Bell inequality, and any experiment that violates it proves that the universe is not locally realistic. Either the particles do not have predetermined properties, or the measurement of one does affect the other instantaneously, or both. There is no way around it. The mathematics is airtight. Alan Aspect's 1982 experiment tested this directly. He created entangled photon pairs, sent them to detectors far enough apart that no signal traveling at the speed of light could pass between them during the measurement, and measured their correlations. The result was decisive. The correlations violated Bell's inequality. They were stronger than any hidden variable theory could explain. The photons were not carrying predetermined instructions. Something was connecting them at the moment of measurement, across space, faster than light, through no known physical mechanism. The implications of this result are staggering, and physicists have spent 4 decades trying to come to terms with them. The universe is non-local. Events in one location are correlated with events in another location in ways that cannot be explained by any signal, any force, or any chain of cause and effect traveling through the space between them. The entangled particles do not communicate. No information passes between them, and yet they are correlated with a precision that is absolute, not statistical, not approximate, but perfect, every single time. This raises a question that cuts to the heart of our investigation. What kind of reality could produce this kind of correlation? If the particles are not communicating, and if their properties are not predetermined, then how are they correlated? The most widely accepted answer in mainstream physics is that entangled particles are not two separate entities. They are one entity, described by a single quantum state that happens to be distributed across 2 locations. The entangled photons do not have individual wave functions. They share a single wave function, a single mathematical description that encompasses both particles simultaneously. When you measure one particle, you are not affecting the other particle at a distance. You are interacting with a single, undivided quantum system and obtaining information that is defined by the system as a whole, not by either particle individually. Let us be clear about what this means. When we say that entangled particles share a single quantum state, we are not saying that they influence each other. We are saying that they are each other, in a precise mathematical sense. The quantum state that describes them is not decomposable into two separate states. It is a single, irreducible description that refers to both particles simultaneously. You cannot describe one particle without reference to the other. Their identities are not independent. They are, at the quantum level, aspects of a single entity. This is called non-separability, and it is one of the most profound features of quantum mechanics. A non-separable system cannot be fully described by describing its parts individually. The whole is not the sum of its parts. The whole is something fundamentally different from the parts, something that contains information and structure that does not exist in any of the parts taken alone. The correlation between entangled particles is a property of the whole system, not a property of either particle individually. This is not a mathematical trick. It is the deepest statement about the nature of reality that quantum mechanics makes. Entangled particles are not connected across space. They are not separate things that happen to be linked. They are, at the deepest level, one thing. The appearance of separation is an artifact of the classical, macroscopic description we impose on a quantum reality that does not respect the boundaries of space and time as we understand them. The physicist David Bohm described this as the implicate order, a deeper level of reality in which everything is enfolded into everything else, and the seemingly separate objects of our experience are projections from this undivided wholeness. The physicist John Bell, reflecting on his own theorem, wrote that the universe appears to be connected at a level that is deeper than we can detect in the quantum correlations, and the physicist Erwin Schrödinger, who coined the term entanglement in 1935, called it the characteristic trait of quantum mechanics, the one that enforces its entire departure from classical lines of thought. Now, the standard physics response to any attempt to connect entanglement to macroscopic phenomena like twin connections is swift and categorical. Entanglement is a quantum phenomenon that applies to subatomic particles. It is destroyed by decoherence by the interaction of quantum systems with their thermal environment. The warm, wet, noisy environment of a biological organism should destroy quantum coherence in femtoseconds, trillionths of a second. Therefore, quantum entanglement cannot operate in biological systems, and any attempt to connect it to the twin phenomenon is pseudoscience. This objection was entirely reasonable 20 years ago. It is no longer tenable today, because over the past 2 decades, a revolutionary new field, quantum biology, has demonstrated that quantum effects, including entanglement, do operate in biological systems in ways that were previously thought impossible. The first breakthrough came from photosynthesis. In 2007, Graham Fleming and his team at the University of California, Berkeley, published a landmark paper in Nature demonstrating that quantum coherence plays a functional role in the photosynthetic process of green sulfur bacteria. When a photon of sunlight hits a light-harvesting complex in a photosynthetic organism, it creates a quantum excitation that must find its way to the reaction center, where it can be converted to chemical energy. The classical expectation was that this excitation would bounce randomly through the molecular complex like a ball in a pinball machine until it happened to reach the reaction center. What Fleming's team discovered was that the excitation travels as a quantum wave, exploring all possible pathways simultaneously through quantum superposition and arriving at the reaction center with near-perfect efficiency. The warm, wet biological environment was not destroying quantum coherence. The biological system was exploiting it. This was not supposed to be possible. Quantum coherence in a warm, wet, noisy biological environment lasting for hundreds of femtoseconds, long enough to affect the efficiency of photosynthesis, contradicted everything that physicists believed about the fragility of quantum states. But the data was clear, and it has been confirmed by subsequent studies at multiple laboratories. Life, it turns out, has been using quantum mechanics for billions of years. The discovery of quantum coherence in photosynthesis opened the floodgates. Researchers began looking for quantum effects in other biological systems and finding them everywhere they looked. Enzyme catalysis, the process by which proteins accelerate chemical reactions in the body, was shown to involve quantum tunneling, a phenomenon in which particles pass through energy barriers that classical physics says they cannot cross. Hydrogen atoms in enzyme-active sites were found to tunnel through barriers rather than climbing over them, dramatically increasing reaction rates. Your metabolism, your digestion, your DNA repair mechanisms all depend on quantum tunneling. Every breath you take, every cell that divides, every wound that heals involves particles doing something that classical physics says is impossible. Even more remarkably, the sense of smell may involve quantum mechanics. The biophysicist Luca Turin proposed that olfactory receptors detect odor molecules not by their shape, as the classical lock and key model suggests, but by their vibrational frequency, a frequency that is detected through quantum tunneling of electrons across the receptor. This quantum theory of olfaction, while still debated, has received experimental support and suggests that your nose is, in effect, a quantum instrument, a biological detector that exploits quantum mechanical principles to extract information from the molecular world. The second breakthrough came from bird navigation. Many species of migratory birds navigate using the Earth's magnetic field, and for decades the mechanism was unknown. In 2008, a team led by Thorsten Ritz at the University of California, Irvine, proposed that the mechanism was quantum specifically, that it involved radical pair reactions in the bird's retina that are sensitive to the orientation of the Earth's magnetic field through quantum entanglement. The radical pair mechanism works as follows. A photon of light creates a pair of molecules with entangled electron spins. The orientation of the Earth's magnetic field affects the spin states of the entangled pair, which in turn affects the chemical reaction rate, which in turn produces a signal that the bird's brain can interpret as directional information. The bird literally sees the magnetic field, using quantum entanglement as the sensor. This hypothesis has been supported by extensive experimental evidence. In 2021, a team at the University of Oxford demonstrated that the radical pair mechanism in cryptochrome proteins, the molecules in the bird's retina responsible for magnetic sensing, is indeed sensitive to quantum effects, and that this sensitivity is maintained in biological conditions at room temperature. Quantum entanglement, operating in a biological system at body temperature in the noisy electromagnetic environment of a living organism, is a proven scientific fact. The third area of quantum biology is even more directly relevant to our question: quantum effects in the brain. The anesthesiologist Stuart Hameroff and the physicist Roger Penrose have proposed, as we have discussed in previous investigations, that consciousness arises from quantum processes in microtubules within neurons. Their orchestrated objective reduction theory remains controversial, but it has received support from experimental findings. In 2022, a team at the University of Alberta, led by physicist Jack Tazinski, published evidence of quantum coherence in microtubules lasting for timescales that are biologically relevant, long enough to affect neural computation. And in 2023, a study published in the Journal of Physics Communications demonstrated that anesthetic gases selectively inhibit quantum processes in microtubules, suggesting a direct connection between quantum coherence and the presence or absence of consciousness. There is also growing evidence for quantum entanglement between neurons within a single brain. A 2022 study published in the journal Communications Physics by researchers at Trinity College Dublin used a technique based on the quantum physics concept of entanglement witnesses to analyze brain signals from healthy volunteers. They found signatures consistent with quantum entanglement in the electrical activity of the brain, correlations between neural processes that could not be explained by classical mechanisms alone. The lead researcher, Christian Kerskens, cautiously noted that the results were suggestive rather than definitive, but that they represented the first empirical evidence that quantum entanglement may play a functional role in brain dynamics. If these findings are confirmed, they would represent a paradigm shift in our understanding of neural processing. If quantum coherence operates in microtubules, and if microtubules are involved in the generation of consciousness, then the possibility of quantum entanglement between the microtubules of two biologically identical brains cannot be dismissed. Identical twins develop from a single fertilized egg that splits. At the moment of splitting, every quantum state in that embryo is shared between the two resulting embryos. The microtubules of both embryos originate from the same quantum system. If quantum coherence is maintained in microtubules for biologically relevant timescales, as the evidence suggests, then the initial quantum entanglement between the two embryos' microtubules may not be instantly destroyed by decoherence. It may persist, in some form, through some mechanism that biology has evolved to protect and exploit, just as it protects and exploits quantum coherence in photosynthesis and magnetic navigation. This is speculative. It must be clearly stated that no experiment has demonstrated entanglement between the brains of identical twins. The hypothesis is at the frontier of science, not at its center, but it is no longer outside the bounds of legitimate scientific inquiry. 10 years ago, the idea that quantum entanglement could operate in any biological system at room temperature was considered impossible. Today, it is established fact. The question is no longer whether biology uses quantum entanglement. The question is how far that usage extends. And if nature has found ways to maintain quantum coherence in the warm, wet environment of a photosynthetic complex and in the electromagnetic chaos of a bird's retina, it is not unreasonable to ask whether nature has also found ways to maintain quantum entanglement in the most complex biological structure ever produced by evolution, the human brain, and if so, whether two brains that originated from the same quantum system, the same fertilized egg, the same embryonic cluster of cells might retain traces of their original quantum unity long after they have become separate organisms living separate lives. Hameroff has speculated that if twin brains share entangled microtubule states, the connection might explain the most puzzling twin phenomena, not just the behavioral parallels, which can be partially attributed to genetics, but the simultaneous physical sensations, the shared emotional states, and the apparent telepathic communication that twins report. If consciousness arises from quantum processes in microtubules, and if the microtubules of identical twins retain entanglement from their shared embryonic origin, then the twins would share, at the most fundamental level, a single quantum state of consciousness distributed across two brains. They would be, in the deepest physical sense, one conscious system expressed through two bodies. There is one more piece of physics that belongs in this picture, and it may be the most important one. In 2013, the physicists Juan Maldacena and Leonard Susskind at Stanford proposed a conjecture that has profound implications for the nature of entanglement. ER equals EPR. The conjecture states that quantum entanglement, the EPR correlation discovered by Einstein, Podolsky, and Rosen, is physically identical to an Einstein-Rosen bridge, commonly known as a wormhole. Every pair of entangled particles, Maldacena and Susskind proposed, is connected by a microscopic wormhole, a tunnel through space-time that links them at a level deeper than the spatial distance between them. If ER equals EPR is correct, then entangled particles are not merely correlated, they are physically connected through the geometry of space-time itself. The correlation between them is not a mysterious action at a distance. It is a consequence of the fact that, at the deepest level of reality, the two particles occupy the same point in the geometry of space-time, despite appearing to be separated in ordinary three-dimensional space. The separation is an illusion produced by the limited dimensionality of our perception. In the deeper geometry, there is no separation. there is only connection. The conjecture has generated enormous excitement in theoretical physics because it suggests a deep connection between quantum information and the geometry of space-time. It implies that space-time itself may be woven from entanglement, that the smooth, continuous fabric of space and time that we perceive is actually constructed from a vast web of quantum entanglements between the fundamental degrees of freedom of the universe. The physicist Mark van Ramsdonk has argued that if you removed all entanglement from a region of space, the region would literally disconnect from the rest of space-time. It would pinch off into an isolated fragment, geometrically disconnected from everything else. Space, in this picture, is made of entanglement. Distance is a measure of how entangled two regions are. And two maximally entangled systems, like two entangled particles, or perhaps like two identical twins, exist at zero distance from each other in the deeper geometry, regardless of how far apart they appear in ordinary space. Apply this to twins. If the connection between identical twins is a form of quantum entanglement, and if entanglement is a wormhole in space-time, then twins are not merely correlated. They are connected through the geometry of reality itself. The parallel lives, the synchronized choices, the shared sensations, the telepathic reports, all of these would be manifestations of a physical connection that exists at a level deeper than ordinary space. The twins appear to be separate because we perceive only three spatial dimensions. In the deeper geometry of space-time, they may be far closer than they appear. They may, in some fundamental sense, occupy the same point. This is physics, not mysticism. ER equals EPR is a serious conjecture published in a serious journal by two of the most respected theoretical physicists alive. It has not been proven, but it is actively researched and widely discussed within the physics community. And its implication that entanglement is a connection through space-time itself transforms our understanding of what the twin connection might actually be. And here is where the contemplative traditions enter the picture again, with a precision that should give any honest investigator pause. In Buddhism, the concept of dependent origination pratitya samutpada teaches that nothing exists independently. Every phenomenon arises in dependence on other phenomena. There are no truly separate objects, no truly isolated events, no truly independent selves. Separation is a conventional description, useful for navigating the world, but ultimately illusory. At the deepest level, everything is interconnected, not metaphorically, not poetically, but ontologically. The boundaries between one thing and another are constructions of perception, not features of reality. The Buddhist teacher Thich Nhat Hanh expressed this with characteristic clarity through his concept of interbeing. A sheet of paper, he observed, contains the tree from which it came, the rain that fed the tree, the sun that powered the tree's growth, the logger who cut the tree, and the parents who raised the logger. Nothing exists in isolation. Everything inter-is with everything else. The paper is not separate from the tree. The tree is not separate from the rain, and you are not separate from any of it. The appearance of separation is, in Buddhist terms, the fundamental ignorance from which all suffering arises. This is structurally identical to what ER equals EPR suggests about the physical universe. Separate objects are connected at a deeper level of geometric reality. The separation we perceive is a product of our limited dimensional perspective. At the deeper level, there is only connection, only interbeing, only what the physicist David Bohm called undivided wholeness in flowing movement. In Christianity, the Apostle Paul developed a theology that speaks directly to this structure. In his first letter to the Corinthians, Paul describes the community of believers as a single body with many members. The eye cannot say to the hand, "I do not need you." The head cannot say to the feet, "I do not need you." Every member is essential, and the suffering of one member is the suffering of all. Paul is not speaking metaphorically. He is describing what he believes to be the actual ontological structure of the spiritual community, a single living organism expressed through multiple individual forms. The individuals appear separate. The body is one. Paul's concept of the body of Christ extends this further. All believers are in Christ. They exist within a larger conscious being that encompasses and connects them. Individual identity persists, but it is contained within a larger identity that is not diminished by being distributed across many bodies. This is not a metaphor for cooperation. It is a claim about the nature of spiritual reality, that multiple apparently separate consciousnesses can be aspects of a single larger consciousness, just as multiple apparently separate organs can be parts of a single larger body. In the Islamic tradition, the concept of Wahdat al-Wujud, the unity of being developed by Ibn Arabi, makes an even more radical claim. There is only one being, God. Everything that appears to exist separately, every person, every object, every event is a manifestation, a self-disclosure, a tajalli of this single divine being. Separation is an appearance, not a reality. The boundary between one person and another is a veil, not a wall, and the connection that twins experience, the uncanny synchronization, the shared sensations, the parallel lives would be, in Ibn Arabi's framework, simply the veil between them being thinner than usual, not because they are special, but because all veils are ultimately illusory, and theirs happens to be transparent enough for the underlying unity to show through. In Hinduism, the Chandogya Upanishad's declaration Tat Tvamasi, thou art that, is the direct assertion that the individual self and the universal self are identical. You are not a fragment of the whole. You are the whole, temporarily appearing as a fragment. The separation between you and every other conscious being is Maya, the creative power of illusion that makes the one appear as many. Twins, in this framework, are two expressions of the one that have retained a particularly transparent connection to their shared source. They remind us of what is true for all of us, that the boundaries we perceive between ourselves and others are constructions, not realities. The Sufi master Jalaluddin Rumi captured this in a single couplet that reads like a poetic formulation of ER equals EPR. You think you are separate from the whole, but you are the whole looking at itself through a tiny window. The window is the body, the room is the universe, and the light that enters through two different windows is not two lights. It is one light entering from two openings. Twins, in Rumi's framework, are windows that happen to be close together on the same wall, close enough that anyone standing outside can see that the light coming through them is the same light. The Kabbalistic tradition in Judaism offers yet another parallel. The concept of the Sephirotic tree describes reality as a network of interconnected divine emanations, all flowing from a single infinite source, Ein Sof, the limitless. Individual souls are sparks of divine light, each one connected to the tree and through the tree to every other spark. The connection between twins would be, in Kabbalistic terms, two sparks that originated from the same branch of the tree, their proximity in the divine structure manifesting as proximity in the physical world. The Zohar, the central text of the Kabbalah, explicitly describes soul pairs, two halves of a single soul that descend into separate bodies but retain their connection across the entire span of physical existence. The convergence between the physics and the traditions is now unmistakable. Physics tells us that entangled particles are one system appearing as two. The traditions tell us that all conscious beings are one awareness appearing as many. Physics tells us that the separation between entangled particles is an artifact of our limited dimensional perspective. The traditions tell us that the separation between individual selves is an artifact of Maya, of ignorance, of the veil. Physics tells us that entanglement may be a connection through the geometry of space-time itself. The traditions tell us that the connection between souls is a connection through the deepest structure of reality. In the next stage of this investigation, we will bring the physics and the twin data together with the neuroscience of consciousness. We will examine the experiments that have directly tested whether entanglement-like correlations exist between human brains. We will confront the hard problem of consciousness and the question of whether individual identity is as fundamental as we assume. And we will ask the most radical version of the question that this entire investigation has been building toward. Are identical twins, two bodies, sharing one entangled conscious soul? And if they are, what does that mean for the rest of us? We have established two things. First, the twin data. Identical twins separated at birth exhibit a degree of behavioral, physiological, and experiential synchronization that exceeds what genetics, epigenetics, and shared environment can explain. Second, the physics. Quantum entanglement produces exactly the pattern of correlation we observe in twins, two entities, once unified, maintaining correlated states across distance through no known physical mechanism, and quantum biology has demonstrated that entanglement operates in living systems at body temperature in ways that were previously thought impossible. Now we must ask the hardest question. Can consciousness itself be entangled? Can the subjective experience of one person be correlated with the subjective experience of another through a quantum mechanical connection? And if so, what does this tell us about the nature of individual identity? The most direct experimental evidence for entanglement-like correlations between human brains comes from a series of experiments that began in Mexico City in the 1990s, conducted by a scientist whose work was as brilliant as his fate was mysterious. Jacobo Grinberg Zilberbaum was a neurophysiologist at the National Autonomous University of Mexico. He had spent his career studying the relationship between consciousness and the brain, drawing on both Western neuroscience and the indigenous shamanic traditions of Mexico. In 1994, he published a paper that sent shockwaves through the small community of consciousness researchers and was almost entirely ignored by mainstream neuroscience. The paper described an experiment called the transferred potential. The protocol was elegantly simple. Two subjects, not twins, but people who had spent time together in meditation, building what Grinberg called a state of direct communication, were placed in separate, electromagnetically shielded rooms, Faraday cages, completely isolated from each other, with no possibility of any electromagnetic signal passing between them. Both subjects were connected to EEG machines that recorded their brain activity in real time. Once the subjects were isolated, one of them was exposed to a series of light flashes. These flashes produced a characteristic brain response called an evoked potential, a measurable spike in electrical activity in the visual cortex that occurs approximately 100 to 300 milliseconds after a visual stimulus. This is a well-established, completely unremarkable neurophysiological response. Every neuroscience textbook describes it. What was not unremarkable was what happened in the other room. The second subject, who received no stimulus of any kind, showed a corresponding electrical response in their brain, a transferred potential that appeared at the same time as the evoked potential in the stimulated subject's brain. The unstimulated brain responded as if it had received the stimulus, despite being completely isolated in a Faraday cage with no physical connection to the other room. The effect was not present in all pairs. It appeared primarily in pairs who had successfully established a meditative connection before being separated into the isolated rooms. Pairs who had not meditated together, or who reported that they had not achieved a sense of connection, showed no transferred potential. The effect was also not present when the stimulated subject was replaced by an empty room with a flashing light. It required a conscious being to receive the stimulus for the correlation to appear in the other brain. Grinberg published these results and then, in December 1994, vanished. He disappeared without a trace, along with his second wife. No body was ever found. No explanation was ever provided. The Mexican authorities investigated for years without resolution. His disappearance remains one of the most disturbing unsolved cases in the history of science. Some of his colleagues believe he was murdered. Others believe he went into hiding. What is certain is that his research program was abruptly terminated, and the transferred potential experiment was left for others to replicate. The mystery of Grinberg's disappearance has inevitably cast a shadow over his research. Skeptics argue that the unresolved circumstances make it difficult to fully evaluate his work. But the work itself was published in peer-reviewed journals, the methodology was transparent, and the results were specific enough to be testable. Whatever happened to Grinberg the man, Grinberg the scientist left behind a clear, experimental protocol that others could follow. Others did replicate it. In 2004, the neuroscientist Liana Standish at Bastyr University in Seattle published a study using functional MRI instead of EEG. She placed paired subjects in separate fMRI machines and exposed one to a visual stimulus while monitoring the brain of the other. She found statistically significant activation in the visual cortex of the unstimulated subject, correlated with the timing of the stimulus delivered to the other subject. The effect was small but measurable, and it appeared in pairs who reported feeling a strong interpersonal connection. In 2005, a team led by Jiri Wackerman at the Institute for Frontier Areas of Psychology in Freiburg, Germany, published a more rigorously controlled replication. Using EEG and strict double-blind protocols, they found evidence of correlated brain activity between paired subjects in isolated rooms. The correlations were subtle, not the dramatic evoked potentials that Grinberg had reported, but statistically significant deviations from baseline that appeared consistently during stimulation periods and not during control periods. In 2015, Patrizio Tresoldi and colleagues at the University of Padova published a meta-analysis of all available studies on distant brain-to-brain correlations. Analyzing the pooled data from multiple laboratories and multiple methodologies, they found a small but statistically significant overall effect. The probability that the pooled result was due to chance was less than 1 in 10,000. The effect was real, albeit small, and it could not be explained by any known electromagnetic or classical physical mechanism. What mechanism could explain these correlations? The researchers themselves have been cautious about proposing mechanisms, but the structure of the data constrains the possibilities. The effect cannot be electromagnetic. Faraday cages block all electromagnetic signals. It cannot be acoustic or thermal. The isolation protocols exclude these. It cannot be any known classical physical signal, because the shielding and the spatial separation rule out all known channels of classical communication. What remains, by elimination, is either an unknown classical mechanism that penetrates Faraday shielding, or a quantum mechanical mechanism specifically, entanglement that does not require any signal to pass between the two brains at all, because entangled systems are correlated without communication. The physicist, Henry Stapp, working at the Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory, has proposed a theoretical framework in which quantum entanglement between brains is not only possible, but expected. Stapp argues that conscious choices involve quantum events in the brain specifically, the selection of which neural pattern becomes actualized from among the many patterns that exist in superposition prior to a conscious decision. If two brains are quantum entangled, their quantum events would be correlated, and the selection process in one brain would be instantaneously reflected in the other. This is not telepathy in the folk sense. No message is sent, no thought is transmitted. It is the simultaneous actualization of correlated quantum states in two physically separated but quantum mechanically unified systems. Now, here is what makes these experiments directly relevant to the twin question. If brain-to-brain correlations can be established between unrelated individuals who have spent time building a meditative connection, Imagine what might exist between identical twins who shared a single quantum system from the moment of conception. The Grinberg-type connection was created artificially through deliberate practice over a period of hours or days. The twin connection, if it follows the same mechanism, has been in place since the moment the embryo split, a quantum connection that has been maintained continuously for the entire lifetime of the twins. The transferred potential in meditation pairs was subtle and inconsistent. In twins, if the same mechanism operates with the advantage of a lifelong quantum connection, the effect could be far stronger and far more reliable. No published study has yet performed the transferred potential experiment specifically with identical twins in Faraday-shielded rooms. This is an extraordinary gap in the scientific literature. The experiment is technically straightforward. The twin population is readily available. The prediction is clear. And yet the experiment has not been done, at least not in any publication that has reached the mainstream literature. Whether this reflects a lack of interest, a lack of funding, or a reluctance to engage with a question that challenges fundamental assumptions about the nature of consciousness is a matter of speculation. While we await that experiment, there is another line of neuroscientific evidence that illuminates the question of shared consciousness from the opposite direction: the phenomenon of split brain patients. In the 1960s, the neurosurgeon Roger Sperry and his student Michael Gazzaniga conducted a series of experiments on patients who had undergone a corpus callosotomy, a surgical procedure in which the corpus callosum, the massive bundle of nerve fibers connecting the left and right hemispheres of the brain, is severed to treat severe epilepsy. The procedure was medically effective, it reduced seizures, but it had an extraordinary side effect. The patients developed two apparently independent conscious agents within a single skull. In the split brain experiments, information presented to the left visual field was processed by the right hemisphere, and information presented to the right visual field was processed by the left hemisphere. Since the corpus callosum was severed, the two hemispheres could no longer communicate. And what Sperry and Gazzaniga discovered was that each hemisphere had its own perceptions, its own preferences, its own decisions, and its own awareness. The left hemisphere, which controls speech in most people, could verbally report what it saw. The right hemisphere could not speak but could guide the left hand to point to objects or draw pictures that indicated its own separate perceptual experience. In one famous demonstration, a split brain patient was shown the word key in the left visual field and the word ring in the right visual field. When asked what he saw, the patient said, "ring," the left hemisphere's verbal report. But when asked to reach behind a screen with his left hand and select the object that matched what he had seen, he picked up a key, the right hemisphere's silent, non-verbal response. Two different perceptions, two different responses in one person. When asked why he had picked up the key, the patient's left hemisphere, the only one that could speak, confabulated an explanation, unaware that the right hemisphere had its own reason. In another striking case, a split brain patient was shown a disturbing image of a fire in the left visual field, which was processed only by the right hemisphere. The patient could not verbally report seeing anything unusual. The left hemisphere, which controlled speech, had not received the image. But the patient's emotional state changed dramatically. She became anxious, uncomfortable, and when asked why she felt upset, the left hemisphere, unaware of the fire image, generated a confabulation. "I don't know. I think I'm afraid of you." The right hemisphere had an emotional experience that leaked across to the left hemisphere through subcortical connections, but the left hemisphere, unable to access the cause, invented an explanation. Two conscious experiences, partially overlapping but fundamentally separate, coexisting in the same skull. Gazzaniga went further in documenting cases where the two hemispheres displayed conflicting intentions. One patient's left hand would reach for a different shirt than the right hand had chosen. Another patient's left hand would turn off the television that the right hand had just turned on. These were not motor glitches. They were manifestations of two distinct agents with distinct preferences, trapped in the same body, each one acting on its own conscious assessment of the situation. The implications for our investigation are profound and unsettling. If severing the physical connection between two hemispheres can create two conscious agents within one brain, then the question of what constitutes a single consciousness is far more flexible than we assumed. Consciousness is not rigidly tied to a single brain. It is tied to a network of integrated neural processing, and when that network is split, consciousness splits with it. One brain can host two minds. Now reverse the direction. If one brain can host two conscious agents when its internal connections are severed, could two brains host a single conscious agent if they are connected by something quantum entanglement, for instance, that integrates their processing at a level deeper than the corpus callosum? The split brain data shows that the unity of consciousness depends on the integration of neural information. It follows that if two brains are integrated through a quantum connection, the result could be a form of shared or distributed consciousness that spans both brains. Not two people who happen to be connected, but one conscious system that is distributed across two bodies. Giulio Tononi's integrated information theory provides the most rigorous framework for thinking about this possibility. In IIT, consciousness is identical to integrated information, the quantity phi, which measures how much information a system generates as a unified whole, above and beyond what its parts generate independently. The higher the phi, the more conscious the system. A brain with high internal integration has high phi and supports rich conscious experience. A brain whose hemispheres are disconnected has lower phi in each hemisphere, and each hemisphere supports its own, reduced conscious experience. The critical insight of IIT for our question is that phi is not limited to single brains. Any system that integrates information can have phi. If two brains are connected in a way that allows information to be integrated between them, not just transmitted, but genuinely integrated, creating a unified informational whole that is more than the sum of its parts, then the two-brain system would have its own phi, its own consciousness, its own unified experience. The twin system would not be two people who share a telepathic link. It would be a single conscious entity, distributed across two bodies, with a unified experience that neither twin could access individually. Consider what this means concretely. If twin brains are quantum entangled at the microtubule level, and if this entanglement creates genuine information integration between the two brains, then the twin system would have a phi value that is greater than the sum of the individual phi values. The whole would literally be more conscious than the parts, and the experience associated with that higher phi would be a unified experience that encompasses information from both brains, an experience that neither twin would recognize as theirs alone, because it would belong to the system, not to either individual. This may be what twins are describing when they report knowing things about each other that they have no way of knowing. Not telepathy in the sense of a message sent from one mind to another, but a unified awareness that encompasses both minds simultaneously. The twin does not receive information from the other twin. The twin accesses information that belongs to the shared system, information that was never localized in one brain or the other, but existed in the integrated space between them. This sounds extraordinary, but it is a direct mathematical consequence of IIT. Tononi himself has acknowledged that his theory implies the possibility of consciousness existing in systems that extend beyond individual brains, though he has been cautious about specifying what kinds of systems might qualify. The theory does not say that twin brains are integrated enough to produce shared consciousness. It says that if they are integrated enough, shared consciousness would necessarily result. The question is empirical, not theoretical. Is the quantum connection between twin brains sufficient to produce genuine information integration? The hard problem of consciousness enters here with full force. David Chalmers' formulation asks why physical processing gives rise to subjective experience at all. But there is a corollary question that is equally hard and less often discussed. Why does subjective experience come in individual units? Why do you have your experience and I have mine? Why is consciousness parceled out into separate selves, each locked inside its own skull, each unable to directly access the experience of any other? The philosopher Thomas Nagel explored this question in his famous essay, What is it like to be a bat? Nagel argued that subjective experience is inherently perspectival. It is always the experience of a particular subject, from a particular point of view. You cannot know what it is like to be a bat because you cannot occupy the bat's perspective, but Nagel's argument assumes that perspectives are inherently singular and bounded. What if they are not? What if the boundaries between perspectives are not absolute but contingent, dependent on the physical connections between the systems that generate them? A split-brain patient's single perspective becomes two when the connection is severed. Could two twins' perspectives become one if their connection is deep enough? The neuroscientist Anil Seth has proposed that consciousness is a form of controlled hallucination, a model that the brain constructs to predict and manage incoming sensory data. Your experience of the world is not a direct readout of what is out there. It is a prediction that the brain generates based on its prior expectations, continuously updated by sensory input. If consciousness is a predictive model, then the boundaries of the model are not fixed. They extend as far as the brain's predictions extend. And if two brains are connected through quantum entanglement, their predictive models might partially overlap each brain, incorporating information from the other into its predictions, blurring the boundary between what is my experience and what is yours. This would explain the phenomenology of twin connection more precisely than any telepathy model. Twins do not report receiving discrete messages from each other. They report a blurring of boundaries, a sense that the other twin's experience is not foreign but familiar, not separate but continuous with their own. This is exactly what you would expect if their predictive models were partially merged through a quantum connection that integrates information across both brains. The philosopher Derek Parfit, in his landmark work Reasons and Persons, argued that personal identity is not what matters in survival. What matters, Parfit claimed, is psychological continuity and connectedness, the preservation of memories, personality traits, intentions, and beliefs. If your brain were gradually replaced, neuron by neuron, with functionally identical neurons, you would remain you not because the physical substrate was the same, but because the psychological pattern was preserved. And if your psychological pattern could be instantiated in two bodies simultaneously, there would be two yous, not copies, but genuine continuations of the same person. Parfit's thought experiment was intended as an abstract philosophical puzzle, but identical twins make it almost literal. Two bodies with the same genetic blueprint, the same neural architecture, the same developmental trajectory, and if the quantum entanglement hypothesis is correct, the same quantum state at the foundation of their consciousness, they are not copies of each other. They are, at the deepest level, instantiations of the same system. And if personal identity is about pattern rather than substrate, then the question of whether they share a soul is not a mystical question. It is a question about the nature of identity itself. The philosopher Daniel Dennett has argued that the self is a center of narrative gravity, not a thing, but a story that the brain tells about itself, a useful fiction that organizes experience into a coherent first-person perspective. If the self is a narrative, then two brains that share a quantum connection might generate overlapping narratives, stories that reference the same deep structure, the same quantum state, the same informational ground. The parallel lives of separated twins, the same names chosen, the same careers pursued, the same quirks developed, could be understood as two narratives being generated from the same underlying story. Not two people making the same choices, but one narrative expressing itself through two storytellers. The philosopher Alva Noé has argued that consciousness is not something the brain does alone. It is something the brain does in interaction with the body and the environment. Consciousness is enacted, not produced. If consciousness is fundamentally relational rather than internal, then the possibility of shared consciousness between twins is not a violation of the rules, it is an extension of them. The twin relationship, with its quantum connection and its lifelong coevolution, would constitute a relational system that supports a form of consciousness that the individual brains could not sustain alone. The contemplative traditions have a response to this question that is remarkably consistent across cultures, and it runs directly counter to the Western assumption that identity is inherently individual. In Buddhism, the concept of anatta non-self is the direct assertion that there is no fixed, bounded, independent self. What you call I is a process, not a thing, a constantly changing stream of sensations, perceptions, thoughts, and intentions that the mind binds together into the illusion of a unified, continuous self. The boundaries of this apparent self are not discovered but constructed, and what is constructed can be deconstructed. In deep meditation, the sense of being a separate self can dissolve entirely, revealing an awareness that does not belong to anyone in particular, an awareness that is, in the Buddhist phrase, without owner. The Buddhist teacher Ajahn Chah used a simple demonstration to illustrate this point. He would hold up a glass and say, "This glass is already broken." The glass appears solid, permanent, and individual, but its individuality is a temporary arrangement of conditions: sand, heat, a glass blower's breath, a particular moment in time. The glass will eventually break, and the conditions that constituted it will disperse and reconstitute into other forms. The glass's individuality was never absolute. It was a pattern, maintained for a time by favorable conditions, and dissolved when those conditions changed. The same, Buddhism argues, is true of the self. Your self is a pattern, maintained by the conditions of your body, your brain, your history, and your relationships. It is real in the way a wave is real, a genuine phenomenon with measurable properties, but it is not a thing, it is a process. And two processes that originate from the same source and maintain a continuous connection may never fully individuate into separate processes. They may remain, at some level, aspects of a single larger process that the categories of self and other cannot adequately describe. If the self is constructed rather than given, then the boundaries between one self and another are also constructed. Two twins who share a quantum connection might experience a degree of self-overlap that most people do not because they are paranormal, but because the normal process of constructing separate selves is partially disrupted by a physical connection that prevents complete individuation. Their selves are not fully separate because the quantum system that underlies their consciousness is not fully separate. The experience of shared sensations, synchronized choices, and mutual awareness would be the natural consequence of incomplete individuation at the quantum level. In the Hindu tradition, the Mandukya Upanishad describes consciousness as having four states: waking, dreaming, deep sleep, and turiya, the fourth state that underlies all the others. Turiya is awareness without content, without boundaries, without individuation. It is the ground state of consciousness from which all individual selves emerge and to which they return. If two twins share a quantum connection that links them at the level of turiya, at the level of pure awareness prior to individuation, then their connection is not a link between two separate selves. It is a shared root in the ground of consciousness itself. They are not two trees with intertwined branches. They are two trunks growing from the same root system. In Islam, the concept of fitra, the innate spiritual nature with which every human being is born, describes a pre-individual state of consciousness that is oriented toward the divine. The Hadith literature, states that every child is born in a state of fitra in pure, unconditioned awareness of God, and it is the parents and the culture that shape the child into a particular individual with particular beliefs. The fitra is universal. It is the same in everyone. It is the common ground from which all individual identities emerge. Twins who maintain an unusually strong connection to their shared fitra would, in this framework, experience the unity that all humans share at the deepest level, but that most of us have buried beneath layers of conditioned individuality. In Christianity, the mystical tradition has long recognized states of consciousness in which individual identity dissolves into union with the divine. The anonymous author of The Cloud of Unknowing describes a contemplative state in which the practitioner loses all sense of individual selfhood and exists in pure, undifferentiated awareness of God. Meister Eckhart described the ground of the soul as a point of identity between the human being and God, a place where the boundary between the individual and the divine disappears entirely. If the ground of the soul is the same in all people, as Eckhart claimed, then any two people who access that ground simultaneously would find themselves in a state of shared consciousness, not because they have connected to each other, but because they have both returned to the single source from which all individual consciousness arises. The pattern is now clear across every domain we have investigated. Neuroscience shows us that consciousness can be split when physical connections are severed, and implies that it can be shared when physical connections are maintained. Integrated information theory provides a mathematical framework in which shared consciousness across two brains is not only possible but necessary, given sufficient integration. The philosophy of personal identity reveals that the boundaries of selfhood are contingent rather than absolute. The quantum physics of entanglement provides a mechanism by which two brains could be integrated at a level deeper than any neural connection. And the contemplative traditions describe a ground of consciousness that is prior to individuation and common to all beings. In the final stage of this investigation, we will bring all of this together into a single, coherent picture. We will ask whether identical twins are, in the most precise scientific and philosophical sense, two bodies sharing one entangled conscious soul. And we will explore what the answer to that question means, not just for twins, but for every human being who has ever felt an inexplicable connection to another person, a recognition, a resonance, a sense that the boundary between self and other is not as solid as it seems. Because if twins are entangled, the question is not whether this phenomenon is limited to twins. The question is whether twins are simply the most visible example of a connection that, at the deepest level of reality, links all conscious beings. We have now assembled every piece of this investigation, and the picture that emerges is unlike anything that mainstream science or mainstream religion, taken separately, has been willing to describe. But taken together, the twin data, the quantum physics, the neuroscience, and the contemplative traditions, they converge on a single, extraordinary possibility that demands to be stated plainly, examined honestly, and held with the appropriate mixture of wonder and caution. Let us lay out the full argument, step by step, and then assess what it means. The twin data is the starting point, and it is not in dispute. The Minnesota study of twins reared apart, conducted over 2 decades at one of the world's leading research universities, published in the most prestigious scientific journals, and never seriously challenged on methodological grounds, established that identical twins separated at birth exhibit a degree of behavioral, psychological, and physiological synchronization that cannot be fully explained by shared genetics. The correlations are too specific, too numerous, and too resistant to environmental variation to be accounted for by DNA alone. Something else connects these twins, something that operates across distance, through time, and without any known physical channel of communication. The quantum physics provides the only known physical phenomenon that exhibits this exact pattern. Quantum entanglement produces correlations between separated systems that are instantaneous, non-local, and cannot be explained by any hidden variable or any signal traveling between the systems. The entangled systems are not two separate things that happen to be linked. They are, at the deepest level of quantum description, one system appearing as two. Their correlation is not transmitted. It is intrinsic. It is a property of their shared quantum state, not a consequence of any interaction between them after separation. Quantum biology has demolished the objection that quantum effects cannot operate in warm, wet biological systems. Quantum coherence in photosynthesis, quantum entanglement in bird navigation, quantum tunneling in enzyme catalysis, and emerging evidence of quantum processes in brain microtubules have collectively established that life does not merely tolerate quantum mechanics. Life exploits it. Biological systems have evolved sophisticated mechanisms to protect and utilize quantum effects for functional purposes. The warm, wet brain is not an obstacle to quantum entanglement. It may be an environment that has been optimized over billions of years of evolution to support it. The neuroscience of consciousness provides the framework for understanding what quantum entanglement between brains would mean. Integrated information theory tells us that consciousness is identical to integrated information, and that any system with sufficient integration has consciousness. If two brains are quantum entangled in a way that produces genuine information integration between them, the resulting system would have its own unified consciousness, a shared awareness that encompasses both brains and that neither brain could generate alone. The split brain data confirms that consciousness can be divided when connections are severed, implying that it can be unified when connections are maintained. And the transferred potential experiments suggest that brain-to-brain correlations can be established through mechanisms that no classical physics can explain. The philosophy of personal identity reveals that the boundaries of selfhood are not absolute. They are contingent on the physical connections that integrate information within a system. Derek Parfit showed that personal identity is about pattern, not substance. Daniel Dennett showed that the self is a narrative, not a thing. Anil Seth showed that the boundaries of conscious experience extend as far as the brain's predictive model extends. And the Buddhist analysis of anatta revealed, 25 centuries before neuroscience existed, that the sense of being a separate, bounded self is a construction, not a discovery. And the contemplative traditions, independently and across every major civilization, describe a ground of consciousness that is prior to individuation, a unified awareness from which all individual selves emerge and to which they return. The Islamic Covenant of Alast describes all souls existing together before being separated into bodies. The Hindu Tat declares that the individual self and the universal self are identical. The Buddhist concept of interbeing asserts that nothing exists independently. The Christian body of Christ describes multiple individuals as members of a single conscious organism, and the Kabbalistic soul pairs describe two halves of a single soul descending into separate bodies while retaining their connection. When you lay all of this side by side, a coherent picture emerges. Not a proven picture, we must be honest about the limits of the evidence, but a coherent, internally consistent, multidisciplinary picture that answers the question we began with. Are identical twins two bodies sharing one entangled conscious soul? The answer, as far as the evidence allows us to go, is they may be. And the framework that supports this answer is not mysticism dressed in scientific language. It is a synthesis of established physics, cutting-edge biology, rigorous neuroscience, careful philosophy, and the accumulated wisdom of the world's oldest investigative traditions. Let us be precise about what this means and what it does not mean. It does not mean that identical twins share every thought, every sensation, and every experience in real time. The entanglement, if it exists, would not produce a complete merger of consciousness. Each twin has their own brain, their own body, their own sensory apparatus, and their own life history. These factors produce genuine individuality, different experiences, different memories, different perspectives. The shared quantum state would be the foundation beneath these individual differences, not a replacement for them. Think of it as two instruments playing from the same musical score. The instruments are different. The acoustics of the rooms they play in are different. The musicians' interpretations vary. But the score, the deep structure from which both performances emerge, is the same. And occasionally, when the conditions are right, the two performances synchronize in ways that cannot be explained by the similarity of the instruments alone. What the framework does mean is that beneath the surface differences of two twin lives, there is a quantum ground state that is literally shared, a single, undivided quantum system from which both twins' conscious experiences emerge. When Jim Lewis chose Salem cigarettes and Jim Springer, independently and without any possible communication, also chose Salem cigarettes, the choice was not transmitted from one mind to the other. It arose from the same quantum ground, the way two waves on the surface of the ocean arise from the same body of water. The waves look separate. They move independently. They crest at different times and break on different shores. But they are the same water, moving through two different channels. The twins are not two people who happen to make the same choices. They are one quantum system whose choices naturally align because the choices emerge from the same source. It does not mean that twin telepathy, as popularly understood, is a proven phenomenon. The evidence for direct mind-to-mind communication between twins is suggestive, but not conclusive. The transferred potential experiments show brain-to-brain correlations, but these correlations are subtle, inconsistent, and far from the dramatic telepathic experiences that twins sometimes report. The anecdotal literature is vast and compelling, but anecdotes are not controlled experiments. What the evidence supports is not telepathy, but something more interesting, a shared quantum ground state that produces correlated experiences without any information being transmitted between the twins. They do not read each other's minds. They share a mind partially, intermittently, and at a level that is usually beneath conscious awareness. It does not mean that consciousness has been explained. The hard problem remains hard. We do not know why quantum processes in microtubules or anywhere else give rise to subjective experience. We do not know why integrated information feels like something from the inside. We do not know why there is awareness rather than mere computation. The twin entanglement hypothesis does not solve the hard problem. It reframes it. Instead of asking why one brain produces one consciousness, we are now asking why one quantum system distributed across two brains might produce one shared consciousness. The mystery has not been dissolved, it has been expanded. What the framework does is something that may be more valuable than solving the hard problem. It unifies two modes of investigation that have been artificially separated for centuries. The scientific investigation of consciousness and the contemplative investigation of consciousness have been conducted in parallel by different communities using different methods, speaking different languages, and arriving at conclusions that neither community recognizes as compatible with the other. The quantum twin framework reveals them as two perspectives on the same phenomenon. The scientist measures phi and finds that consciousness requires integration. The meditator dissolves the boundaries of self and finds that consciousness is already integrated. The physicist describes entanglement as non-separability. The mystic describes enlightenment as non-duality. The neuroscientist finds that split brains produce split consciousness. The contemplative finds that unified practice produces unified awareness. They are all describing the same elephant from different angles in different languages. And the twins are the place where these descriptions converge most visibly. They are the natural experiment in which the quantum, the neural, the psychological, and the spiritual all manifest together. in measurable form, in the lives of real people. But here is what the framework does mean, and it is profound enough to change the way you think about yourself and every person you have ever met. If the boundaries of consciousness are contingent rather than absolute, if they depend on physical connections that can be strengthened, weakened, created, and destroyed, then individuality is not a metaphysical given. It is a variable. It is something that can exist in degrees. You can be more individual or less individual depending on the strength of the connections that link your consciousness to the consciousness of others. Twins are at one extreme of this spectrum, maximally connected, minimally individuated. Strangers are at the other extreme, minimally connected, maximally individuated. But no one is at zero. No one is completely disconnected. Because if quantum entanglement is a feature of the universe, and it is, and if biological systems exploit quantum entanglement, and they do, then every interaction between two conscious beings creates, at the quantum level, a degree of entanglement between them. Every handshake, every conversation, every shared meal, every moment of eye contact, every act of love, and every act of hatred creates a quantum correlation between the interacting systems. Most of these correlations are vanishingly weak. They are drowned out by the thermal noise of the macroscopic world. They decohere almost instantly and leave no measurable trace, but they exist. And in certain conditions, conditions of sustained attention, emotional intensity, physical proximity, or biological identity, they may be strong enough to produce the kind of correlated experience that twins report. The Grinberg experiments suggest exactly this. Two unrelated people, after spending time in shared meditation, developed measurable brain-to-brain correlations. They were not twins. They did not share a genome. They shared an intention, a sustained, focused, mutually directed act of conscious attention. And that act of attention created a connection that was detectable in the Faraday-shielded isolation of separate rooms. If sustained attention between strangers can create a measurable quantum correlation, imagine what a lifetime of shared experience between lovers, between parents and children, between close friends can create. Imagine what decades of shared prayer in a religious community can create. Imagine what centuries of shared contemplative practice in a monastic tradition can create. This is where the contemplative traditions reveal their deepest significance. They are not merely describing a philosophical position about the unity of consciousness. They are prescribing a practice, a set of specific, repeatable actions designed to strengthen the connections between individual consciousnesses and the shared ground from which they arise. In Islam, the practice of congregational prayer, Salat al-Jama'ah, is not merely a social obligation. It is a technology for creating shared consciousness. When Muslims pray together, standing shoulder to shoulder, facing the same direction, performing the same movements, reciting the same words, breathing in the same rhythm, they are doing exactly what the Grinberg protocol prescribes: sustained, synchronized, mutually directed conscious attention. The Hadith literature states that congregational prayer is 27 times more meritorious than individual prayer. This is usually interpreted as a moral teaching about community. But consider the quantum framework. 27 times more meritorious might mean 27 times more effective at creating the quantum correlations that link individual consciousnesses into a shared field. The mosque is not just a place of worship, it is a laboratory for collective consciousness. In Christianity, the Eucharist, the communal sharing of bread and wine in remembrance of Christ, is described as a mystical participation in a single body. Paul's theology is explicit. By sharing the Eucharist, the individual believers are united into the body of Christ. They become members of a single organism, sharing a single life, animated by a single spirit. This is usually understood as a metaphor for community solidarity, but in the quantum framework, it may describe something more literal. a ritual designed to create and strengthen quantum entanglement between the participants, using the tools of shared attention, shared intention, synchronized action, and emotional intensity. The Church is not just a community, it is a network of entangled consciousnesses, strengthened by every act of shared worship. The mother-child bond offers another compelling case. Every mother who has felt her child's distress before any signal was received, every parent who has woken in the middle of the night moments before the baby cries, every mother who has described a physical sensation in her own body at the moment her child is injured miles away. All of these reports follow the same pattern as the twin data, and the biological basis for quantum entanglement between mother and child is even more direct than between twins. The child's cells develop inside the mother's body for 9 months. Fetal cells cross the placental barrier and take up permanent residence in the mother's tissues, a phenomenon called microchimerism that has been documented in every organ studied, including the brain. Fetal cells have been found in the mother's brain decades after the child's birth. If quantum entanglement can persist between biological systems that share a common origin, the mother-child bond is the second strongest candidate. After identical twins, two bodies that literally shared cells, shared blood, shared biological space for 9 months of continuous quantum interaction, the Islamic tradition recognizes this explicitly. The Prophet Muhammad, when asked who deserves the most companionship, answered, "Your mother," 3 times before answering "your father." The Quran describes the mother's womb as a sacred space and places extraordinary emphasis on the bond between mother and child. This is usually understood as a moral teaching about gratitude and respect. But in the quantum framework, it may reflect an empirical observation. The mother-child connection is quantifiably stronger than other human bonds because the quantum entanglement between them is quantifiably deeper, established over 9 months of continuous biological contact maintained by microchimeric cells that persist for a lifetime. In Buddhism, the Sangha, the community of practitioners, is considered one of the 3 jewels, equal in importance to the Buddha and the Dharma. This is a remarkable elevation of community to the level of the teacher and the teaching themselves. The Sangha is not merely a support group for individual practice. It is, in the Buddhist understanding, a field of shared consciousness that makes individual awakening possible. The practice of metta meditation, the systematic cultivation of loving kindness directed toward all beings, is a direct technology for extending the quantum connections that link individual consciousnesses. Each moment of genuine goodwill directed toward another being creates or strengthens a quantum correlation. The practice of metta is the deliberate creation of entanglement on a universal scale. In Hinduism, the concept of darshan, the practice of being in the physical presence of a saint, a guru, or a divine image, is understood as a transformative act. Simply being seen by a realized being, or simply seeing them, is believed to confer spiritual benefit. This sounds like superstition until you consider the Grinberg data. Sustained, focused, mutually directed attention between 2 conscious beings creates measurable quantum correlations. Darshan is not a passive act of observation. It is a mutual entanglement event in which the consciousness of the devotee and the consciousness of the realized being become correlated at the quantum level. The benefit of darshan in this framework is not magical. It is physical, a quantum correlation that links the devotee's consciousness to the deeper, more integrated consciousness of the teacher. In the Sufi tradition, the practice of Sima, the whirling meditation of the Mevlevi order, combines synchronized movement, shared music, collective intention, and sustained altered states of consciousness into a single practice that is, from the quantum perspective, an extraordinarily powerful entanglement generator. The whirling dervishes are not performing a dance. They are creating a field of shared consciousness through the precise manipulation of the conditions that quantum biology tells us are necessary for biological entanglement. Synchronized neural oscillations, emotional coherence, and sustained mutual attention. The implications of this extend beyond religious practice into the very structure of human civilization. If shared attention creates quantum correlations, and if those correlations produce genuine, measurable effects on the participants' consciousness and well-being, then every form of human gathering, from the concert hall to the sports stadium, from the protest march to the funeral, from the classroom to the operating theatre, is a potential entanglement event. The feeling of unity that audiences report at great musical performances, the collective emotion that sweeps through a crowd at a pivotal moment in a sporting event, the shared grief that binds mourners at a funeral, all of these may be, at the quantum level, exactly what they feel like from the inside. Genuine experiences of shared consciousness, produced by temporary quantum correlations between the brains of the participants. The Global Consciousness Project data that we discussed in our investigation of the evil eye, the statistically significant deviations in random event generators during events of mass emotional attention, may be another manifestation of this same phenomenon. When millions of people direct their attention and emotion toward the same event simultaneously, the collective quantum field they create may be strong enough to influence physical systems beyond the biological. The random event generators are not measuring telepathy. They may be measuring the physical footprint of collective consciousness, the quantum signature of millions of entangled minds, temporarily unified by shared attention and shared emotion. In Judaism, the concept of minyan, the requirement that certain prayers be recited only in the presence of at least 10 adult members of the community, reflects the same understanding. Prayer is more powerful in community not because God is more attentive to group petitions, but because the quantum field created by 10 synchronized consciousnesses is qualitatively different from the field created by one. The Kabbalistic tradition makes this explicit. When 10 souls pray together, they create a spiritual vessel capable of receiving divine light that no individual soul could contain. 10 entangled consciousnesses in the quantum framework would produce a system with a phi value far exceeding anything an individual brain could generate, a system whose integrated information, and therefore whose consciousness, transcends individual awareness. The picture that emerges from this synthesis is remarkable in its coherence. Quantum entanglement is a fundamental feature of the universe. Biological systems exploit entanglement for functional purposes. Consciousness may arise from quantum processes in the brain, and the world's contemplative traditions have developed, over millennia, a comprehensive set of practices designed to create, strengthen, and exploit quantum entanglement between human consciousnesses, practices that they describe in their own languages as the cultivation of love, compassion, community, and union with the divine. The twins are the proof of concept. They show us that two bodies can share a consciousness that transcends the boundaries of individual brains. Their connection was not created by practice or intention. It was given at conception, a quantum entanglement that originated in the moment a single cell became two. But the contemplative traditions suggest that what twins receive as a gift, the rest of us can cultivate as a practice, through sustained attention, through shared intention, through the ancient technologies of prayer, meditation, and communal worship. We can strengthen the quantum connections that link us to each other and to the ground of consciousness from which all individual selves arise. This is not proven. Let us be clear about that. The quantum entanglement hypothesis for twin connections has not been experimentally confirmed. The Grinberg-type experiments have not been performed with identical twins in conditions that would satisfy the most rigorous skeptics. The theoretical frameworks connecting quantum entanglement to consciousness remain speculative, and the contemplative tradition's descriptions of shared consciousness, however consistent and however ancient, are not scientific evidence in the modern sense. The experiment that would settle the question is conceptually simple. Take identical twins who report a strong connection, place them in separate Faraday cages with no possibility of classical communication, monitor their brain activity with high-resolution EEG and fMRI simultaneously. Subject one twin to a series of random stimuli and look for correlated responses in the unstimulated twin's brain. Compare the results with a control group of unrelated strangers and a second control group of fraternal twins. If identical twins show significantly stronger brain-to-brain correlations than either control group, and if those correlations cannot be explained by shared genetics alone, the evidence for quantum entanglement between twin brains would be compelling. This experiment could be performed with existing technology, at existing facilities, for a modest budget. The fact that it has not been performed says more about the sociology of science than about the difficulty of the question. But the convergence is real. The structural parallels between the physics, the neuroscience, the philosophy, and the contemplative traditions are too precise and too consistent to be dismissed as coincidence. Something is connecting identical twins at a level that current science cannot fully explain. Something is producing brain-to-brain correlations in meditation pairs that no classical mechanism can account for. And something has motivated every major civilization on Earth to develop practices specifically designed to dissolve the boundaries between individual consciousnesses and to access a shared awareness that the traditions describe as more real, more fundamental, and more valuable than anything that individual consciousness can produce alone. The question with which we began this investigation was whether identical twins are two bodies sharing one entangled conscious soul. The answer we have arrived at is that they may be, and that if they are, the implications extend far beyond twins. Because the deepest message of this investigation is not about twins at all. It is about you. It is about the nature of your consciousness, the boundaries of yourself, and the connections that link you to every other conscious being. The twins are a window, a uniquely transparent window through which we can see a truth that applies to all of us. That individuality is not absolute, that separation is not fundamental, and that the boundaries between one consciousness and another are not walls but veils. Veils that can thin, that can lift, that can dissolve entirely under the right conditions. Every tradition we have examined says the same thing in its own voice. Islam says that all souls testified together before God in the primordial covenant, and that the connections between them persist through all the separations of earthly life. Christianity says that all believers are members of a single body, animated by a single spirit, and that love is the force that makes the body whole. Buddhism says that the sense of being a separate self is the fundamental illusion from which all suffering arises, and that awakening is the recognition that no boundary between self and other has ever truly existed. Hinduism says that Atman is Brahman, that the awareness at the center of your being is the awareness at the center of every being, and that the appearance of multiplicity is Maya, the creative play of a consciousness that is eternally one. The Sufi tradition adds the final brushstroke to this picture. Ibn Arabi described the relationship between the one and the many as the relationship between a single light and the many-coloured windows through which it shines. The light is one. The colours are many, but the colours do not fragment the light. They reveal it. Each window shows a different aspect of the same illumination. And if two windows are cut from the same glass, the light that passes through them will be identical in colour, identical in intensity, identical in every measurable quality, not because the windows communicate with each other, but because they are shaped by the same material and illuminated by the same source. The twins are two windows cut from the same glass. The rest of us are windows cut from different glass but illuminated by the same light. And quantum physics, the youngest and most precise of these investigative traditions, says that two systems that have once interacted are never truly separate again. that the correlation between them persists across any distance, that the universe, at its deepest level, is not a collection of isolated objects, but a single, entangled, non-separable whole. The twins know this. They have always known it. They feel it in the synchronized beating of their hearts, in the parallel choices of their lives, in the uncanny sense that the boundary between them is permeable, that the other is not fully other, that somewhere beneath the surface of their separate lives there is a single thread that has never been cut. The question is whether you know it too, whether you can feel it in the connections that matter most to you. The parent who knows something is wrong before the phone rings, the lover who finishes your sentence with a word you had not yet thought of, the stranger across a crowded room whose eyes meet yours and produce a shock of recognition that has no rational explanation. The traditions say these connections are real. The physics says the mechanism exists. The neuroscience says the brain can support it. And the twins, those extraordinary living proof of concept experiments in shared consciousness, say that two bodies can, in fact, share something so deep, so persistent, and so intimate that the word soul may be the only word adequate to describe it. Whether that word is a metaphor or a description of something literal is a question that each person must answer for themselves. But after everything we have seen, the physics, the biology, the neuroscience, the philosophy, and the testimony of every contemplative tradition on earth, the possibility that it is literal can no longer be dismissed as wishful thinking. It is a possibility that the evidence supports, that the traditions affirm, and that the twins embody every day of their parallel, entangled, mysteriously unified lives.